Hello and welcome to Subversive Radio. I'm your host, Keith Giles, and we are going to do a very special series of podcasts called Jesus Without Religion or Politics. Now, I've been hosting a series of face-to-face meetings through meetup.com out here in Southern California, and those have been going pretty well. Of course, a lot of people, who follow my blog or my podcast or other things online have asked me about it and want to know, what it's all about. What do we actually talk about in these sessions? So just so I can share this with more people, I thought, why don't I actually conduct the sessions in a series of podcasts? So that's what I'm going to do. So let's pretend that you are attending the Jesus Without Religion or Politics meetup groups, and this is the information that we would cover. Unfortunately, this won't be a dialogue. The goal of those sessions is to be more of a conversation, but at least you can understand the content of what it is we're going to talk about, and hopefully this will help you understand more about who Jesus is and what Jesus was all about. And some people have even decided to take up this idea and host their own series of events, and if you're interested in that, please contact me at my blog or Twitter or online, Facebook, etc., and I'll share with you all of my notes, all of my background materials, and I'll do all I can to help you host your own Jesus Without Religion or Politics. I know there's one for sure going on in Florida, and so yeah, it's pretty cool. Anyway, so here we are, Session 1, Jesus Without Religion or Politics. So as we're looking at Jesus, and here at the beginning, what we want to do is let's ask ourselves a couple of questions. I think one question that kind of drives this entire series of discussions about Jesus is simply this. Why is it that Jesus is so attractive? And why is it that Christians are so offensive? And I know that's not across the board. Not all Christians are offensive, present company accepted, of course. But it is still true that many people, when asked if they like what they think about Jesus, will say very positive things about Jesus. Even people that aren't Christians will say, yeah, Jesus was a pretty great guy. But when you ask them what they think about church or what they think about Christians, not so much. Well, I think one of those reasons is it's very obvious as we look at Jesus to see the differences between Jesus and how he behaved and the way most Christians today, and again, I say most, I'm talking in generalities here, but it seems anyway that most of the Christians, certainly the ones with the biggest platforms, with the biggest audiences, with the biggest media exposure, seem to not really resemble Jesus. And maybe some Christians that we know personally also don't represent Jesus very well. For example, Jesus was really very, very critical of the religious elite, but seemed to go pretty easy on the people that we would call the outcasts and even the sinners, the drunkards, the tax collectors, the prostitutes. It's pretty astounding. And yet we see almost the exact opposite going on in the modern church today, certainly in the West. And so obviously that is the problem. The problem is that Christians aren't very much like Jesus, and frankly, Christians could really benefit from taking a moment to sit back and look at Jesus. Who was he? What was he all about? If Christians are supposed to be following this guy named Jesus, we really can't do that if we don't even really know who he was, what was his message, what was he really all about. And that's, of course, what we want to talk about in this series of podcasts. So, Jesus was on the scene about 2,000 years ago. If typically when I'm doing this in person, face-to-face with people, I will draw sort of a timeline, and I'll start with the cross, which just represents Jesus, really, at the beginning of his ministry. And that lasted about 3 years. Now, we know it ended with the cross, but I use the cross as a symbol just on the timeline to signify Jesus. And if you think about it, Jesus only had a ministry about 3 years long. Only 3 years of ministry. And yet, the impact that Jesus made sent out ripples that 2,000 years later are still being felt all over the world. That is astounding. He started off with only 12 followers. One of them betrayed him. One of them denied him. They all scattered. And yet, Jesus was still able to have an impact on the world that is still being felt today. Now, if we look at that timeline, we see that very soon after there, we had sort of a golden period, kind of a golden age of the Christian church, where Christians did look a lot like Jesus. If you read the book of Acts, you see people selling property to share their money with the poor among them, the people that didn't even know their names a few days before that, and yet now they're treating them like members of their own family. That was because of the love of Jesus, the impact of the power of the ministry of Jesus and the Holy Spirit. For really about 300 years of church history, pretty nearly unblemished, we have a Christian church that looks a lot like Jesus, or looks a lot more like Jesus than we see examples of today. And then we come into, historically, the time of Constantine, where I believe there was a shift that was made in the way people communicated what it meant to be a Christian. But up to that point, being a Christian meant a lot more, or was reflected a whole lot more in the way you behaved, the way you did look like Jesus or not. After Constantine, the definition of a Christian began to be more about, do you believe these doctrines? Do you believe the right things? So it became more about information and not about transformation. And that is unfortunately still kind of the case today. But again, continuing forward in our timeline, we have some black eyes on the church. We have Christians killing other Christians within a generation of Constantine taking power and making Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. That we see the rise of the Roman Catholic Church and a lot of abuses happening there. We see the Crusades, where again Christians were killing other people who didn't believe the way they did. You have the Spanish Inquisition, again, Christians torturing other Christians for not believing the right things. You have the Reformation, where, again, it also happened that the Anabaptists were put to death by the Reformers for not having the right theology. Another black eye. Calvin and Luther kind of signing, rubber stamping a lot of that and not opposing it. We have the rise of things like dispensationalism, which really gave rise to a rampant nationalism, where Christianity and nationalism gets all wrapped in together. And today we're reaping that in America, where people can't think of following Jesus apart from their patriotism or their nationalism or their politics. And so here we are. Here we stand in 2016, or whenever you're listening to this. We're trying to look all the way back. We're turning around and we're looking back in time, down that timeline, and we're trying to see Jesus. But we are having a difficult time seeing who Jesus really was because of all of what I just said, because of all the things that stand between us and Jesus. And that's just some of it. I haven't touched on all of it. We don't have time to go into all of it, but there's just a whole lot of stuff standing between us and really Jesus. And the whole purpose of this series of sessions that we're going to go through is intended as much as possible, because I'm not sure it's completely possible, but as much as possible to remove all of those distractions, all of those filters, and to as much as possible get as clear a picture what's the word I'm looking for? To, just to get as clear a picture as possible as we can of Jesus and to understand who he really was and what was he really about. So in this first session, we're going to take it a little bit light. I'm just going to brush on a couple of things about Jesus. One of them is what people have said about Jesus. I think it's really fascinating that through the years, Jesus has had an astounding impact on many people. Many of them, by the way, are not Christians. One of the most famous ones is Gandhi, and I'm just going to read one quote, but there are many, many quotes about where Gandhi talks very, very positively about Jesus. He says, here's a quote. He says, "I have regarded Jesus of Nazareth as one among the mighty teachers that the world has had. I shall say to the Hindus that your lives will be incomplete unless you reverently study the teachings of Jesus." Wow. Muhammad had this to say about Jesus. O God, bless your messenger and your servant Jesus, son of Mary. Peace be on him the day he was born and the day he dies and the day he shall be raised alive. Such was Jesus, son of Mary. This is a statement of the truth concerning which they doubt. And by the way, that quote is from the Quran, but it's also inscribed within the Dome of the Rock, the temple in Jerusalem. Incredible. Napoleon had this to say about Jesus. He says, I know men, and I tell you that Jesus Christ was not a man. Superficial minds see a resemblance between Christ and the founders of empires and the gods of other religions. That resemblance does not exist. It is not so with Christ. Everything in him astonishes me. His spirit overawes me, and his will confounds me. Between him and everyone else in the world, there is no possible term of comparison. He is truly a being by himself. I will tell you, Alexander, Caesar, Charlemagne, and myself have founded great empires, but our empires were founded on force. Jesus alone founded his empire on love, and to this day, millions would die for him. Wow, pretty amazing. Josephus, who, by the way, was a Jewish historian, not a Christian, who lived during the time period of AD 70 of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, and who wrote about it in his histories, Antiquities of the Jews, had this to say about Jesus. He says, Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day. As the divine prophets had foretold, these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct to this day. Dostoevsky had this to say about Jesus. He says, I believe there is nothing lovelier, deeper, more sympathetic, more rational, more manly, and more perfect than the Savior. I say to myself with jealous love that not only is there no one else like him, but that there could be no one like him. Charles Dickens says this about Jesus. My dear children, I am very anxious that you should know something about the history of Jesus Christ, for everybody ought to know about him. No one ever lived who was so good, so kind, so gentle, and so sorry for all people who did wrong, or were in any way ill or miserable as he was. Florence Nightingale said this about Jesus. Jesus Christ raised women above the condition of mere slaves, mere ministers to the passions of the man, raised them by his sympathy to be ministers of God. The great philosopher Soren Kierkegaard says, There is only one eternal hope on this earth, to follow Christ into heaven. There is one blessed joy in this life, to follow Christ. In death there is one final blessed joy, to follow Christ to life. Mark Twain says, I love this quote, by the way. Mark Twain says, If Christ were here now, there is one thing he would not be, a Christian. These last two here are from H.G. Wells and Albert Einstein, who again are not Christians, but had this to say. H.G. Wells has this to say about Jesus. I am not a believer, but I must confess as a historian that this penniless preacher from Nazareth is irrevocably the center of history. Jesus Christ is easily the most dominant figure in all history. And Albert Einstein says, I am a Jew, but I am enthralled by the luminous figure of the Nazarene. No one can read the Gospels without feeling the actual presence of Jesus. His personality pulsates in every word. No myth is filled with such life. And these quotes, by the way, are posted on my blog. If you're curious, you can go to my blog at keithgiles.com. There's a search bar at the top left. You can just search Jesus without religion or politics, and you'll find that. So pretty cool, huh? I think that's pretty amazing. And so Jesus has had an incredible impact on many historical figures through the years, including myself, not that I'm a historical figure, and millions of other people all over the world from many, many other nations. Another way Jesus has had an impact on our culture, by the way, is in the introduction of phrases that originate with Jesus and have become a part of, at least in the West, have become a part of our everyday conversation. So I have compiled a list. I'm sure this is not exhaustive, but these are phrases that people use every day, and they don't realize it, but they're quoting Jesus when they do this. So here are some phrases that you may pick up on. You may hear this, and you may use these yourself on a regular basis, and you may not realize it, but Jesus was the first to say these things. Jesus talks about going the extra mile. Jesus says the truth will set you free. Jesus is the one who said the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Jesus is the one who told us to beware of wolves in sheep's clothing. Jesus was the one who coined the phrase, the Good Samaritan. If you say that someone is the salt of the earth, that idea started with Jesus. If someone says, hey, don't cast your pearls before swine, that's also from Jesus. If anyone ever uses the phrase, this is the blind leading the blind, or count the cost, or do unto others as you could have them do unto you, all of that is Jesus. If anyone says, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, that's a phrase originated by Jesus in his teachings. Man does not live by bread alone. That also comes from Jesus. Walking the straight and narrow, or the straight and narrow path, that's also Jesus. Turn the other cheek, of course, is Jesus. And the idea of the prodigal son, or the return of the prodigal, that also comes from Jesus. So, a lot of times people are just in everyday, ordinary conversation. This happens to me quite a bit. Where I work is not a Christian organization. And all the time, people who aren't Christians will use those phrases, and I always want to just say, hey, you're quoting Jesus. But of course, they have no idea. But again, that's just one of the other ways that Jesus continues to have an impact on our world and on our culture. And one of the ways, I think one of the most profound, it's sort of a poem or an observation that kind of encapsulates this idea, was written by a man named James Allan Francis back in 1963, and it was something called One Solitary Life. And it's about Jesus, but he makes a really powerful observation about Jesus and his impact on the world. He says, here is a man who was born in an obscure village, the child of a peasant woman. He grew up in another obscure village where he worked in a carpenter shop until he was 30. And then for 3 years, he was an itinerant preacher. He never wrote a book. He never held an office. He never owned a home. He never had a family. He never went to college. He never put his foot inside a big city. He never traveled 200 miles from the place where he was born. He never did one of the things that usually accompany greatness. He had no credentials but himself. While still a young man, the tide of public opinion turned against him. His friends ran away. One of them denied him. He was turned over to his enemies. He went through the mockery of a trial. He was nailed to a cross between two thieves. His executioners gambled for the only piece of property he had on earth while he was dying, and that was his coat. When he was dead, he was taken down and laid in a borrowed grave through the pity of a friend. 19 and now 20 wide centuries have come and gone, and today he is the centerpiece of the human race and the leader of the column of progress. I am far within the mark when I say that all the armies that ever marched, and all the navies that were ever built, and all the parliaments that ever sat, and all the kings that ever reigned put together, have not affected the life of man upon this earth as powerfully as has that one solitary life. And that is true. It is amazing. Jesus is an astounding individual. I dare say that he's right. And H.G. Wells and Einstein and others that I've just read, and Gandhi, are right. There really is no one like Jesus, even just from a purely historical standpoint. If you're not someone who has put faith in Christ, you're not a religious person, you're not someone who who believes in supernatural things and miracles, and you don't believe in God, you don't believe in spirits, you don't believe in angels, you don't believe in demons, you think all that's nonsense. That's fine. But here's what I believe you cannot deny, that the person of Jesus, and whoever he was, had an impact like no one else on human history, and an impact that is still being felt today. Now, in our sessions, I have not yet gone to the level of taking really what I would call a step back from this, talking about Jesus, to talk about the Bible, to say, well, how do we know the Bible is true? And then I could do that. And if I need to do that, I will in our sessions. I'm not going to do that in this podcast series. I may do a separate podcast series about that. But I will, at least on this point, I would say this. There is a non-Christian, well, I should say a formerly Christian skeptic. And his name is Bart Ehrman. And he is probably one of the most notorious anti-Christian apologists out there. And there's a clip of him. You can go to YouTube and find it, of him. He's a guest on a podcast, I believe, or some radio show, but I believe it's a podcast. And it's fascinating because he spends about 10 to 15 minutes, again, not a believer, but he spends about 10 or 15 minutes arguing with the host about the fact that Jesus existed and that Paul and the other apostles really existed, and that, they really did write down those Gospels, and Paul really did write his epistles. That you can argue whether or not you believe what they claim, but you can't argue historically. It's just not worth arguing because there is so much evidence. There are many extra biblical, that means beyond the Bible, sources that corroborate the idea that there was someone named Jesus of Nazareth. He did live during that time period. He did do miracles, or at least what people called miracles, whether they were tricks, whether he was a magician, or whether he really did miracles or not. The point is, the stories about him by non-Christians verify that he existed. He did miracles, so-called, or maybe for real, but he did exist. He did do miracles. People did believe he was the Messiah. He was arrested. He was crucified. His disciples did claim that he had risen from the dead. And we have writings from early church fathers in the early 1st century going through all the way through the 3rd, 4th, 5th century of them talking about having seen a risen Jesus, having faith in Jesus, quoting the teachings of Jesus. And so really, you really can't argue persuasively against the idea that there was a historic Jesus. Jesus is an historic figure. He did live. He did exist. He did say the things that we have written down in the Gospels. And we know that through the Bible, because the New Testament is an historic document. And we know that from extra biblical sources like the early church fathers, as well as people like Josephus and Tacitus and Pliny and people like that. So many historians, both Roman, pagan, Jewish, and Christian, back all of that up. So Jesus did have this impact. He continues to have an impact, and that's why we're going to take some time to study the life of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus. So here's what's coming up. Our second session, we're going to look at Jesus' message. What was his message? He called it good news. Many call it the gospel. The gospel just means good news. So that's what our second session is going to look at. And then after that, we'll look at his teaching, which were called parables. They were basically little stories that he told to illustrate the ideas that he wanted to get across. And we'll look at that. Why did he do that? Why did he speak in parables? Why didn't he just say it plainly? Why did he use these little stories? So that'll be session 3. Session 4, we'll look at his manifesto, which is his Sermon on the Mount. Session 5, we'll look at the Lord's Prayer, which many people are familiar with, but I don't think they really see it as deeply and clearly as Jesus intended. And session 6, we'll look at Jesus as a prophet, as well as someone who fulfilled prophecy from the Old Testament scriptures, because there were many prophecies about the Messiah. And if Jesus is the Messiah, then he probably needs to fulfill those prophecies. And if he doesn't, then he isn't the Messiah. But if he did, we want to look at that. And our final session, we will look at the crucifixion and the validity of the claims about the resurrection. So that's what we're going to be doing going forward. I hope you'll stay with us, and I hope you'll enjoy these sessions. Some of these are going to get kind of long. We might have to break a couple of them into part 1 and part 2, but anyway, we'll eventually get it all down. And again, thank you for listening. if you have any questions or anything like that, please leave them at the podcast or at the blog or at keithgiles.com or on Twitter or Facebook. I'd appreciate it. And again, thank you for listening. Until then, until next time, good night, God bless, and let the kingdom come.